goal is to talk to you a little bit about what does meaningful relationships mean, and what's it mean to try to do that in this time that none of us planned for this, and none of us have thought through this very effectively. And I think as I was looking at the chat of the 35 and now 36 of you with the two words, right? Tired, exhausted, stressed, hopeful, hungry, right? I think there's some very clear kinds of feelings, right? So I want to note that there's moments of rejuvenation and joy and hope that were sprinkled in the words that you all are sharing. But I don't think it's a surprise. It's funny, when I joined at the beginning, I think everyone was being honest about how they were doing, and so they're like, "How are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm fine," and just like moved on. Like, I'm definitely like, no one's fine right now, right? And so it was a useful reminder, and I appreciated Brandon, Janelle, Robin, and Anna calling me out on that fact, right? That like, you're not fine. Like, let's be real about this for a second. So the two questions I always start with, and we've already kind of gotten to these, but I've been working with NCTE teachers for a little while now, and we start every week with these questions of how are you and what's your bomb, and what we mean by bomb. I write it out because it always sounds like bomb, which is like a very different kind of connotation of what I'm not asking you. But what's your bomb, right? What's the thing that's soothing you, that's bringing you joy? It might be a text, it might be a show, it might be a person, it might be a place. Take a minute if you have a balm that comes to mind. I'd say share that, because other people sometimes are looking for a thing to remind them. It can be the little thing, right? What's the little treat you're giving for yourself, or the words of affirmation you write down for yourself. But if you have one, yeah, chai tea and fuzzy slippers. I think that's right. I don't know. I can't say if that's right for you, Anna, but those feel balm-like. Who am I to assess your balms? My dog and Taco Bell. I like that. That's I like those in combination. And I think it's important for us to, like the vibe check. Let's start with like what's the thing, the honest question of how are you is just a question that I think is important for us to always sit with. I'm going to come back to this idea towards the end of this conversation too. It's not much of a conversation. It's me talking at you for a few minutes. So what I want to do is bad pedagogy, and so what I'm going to tell you the things you shouldn't do, right? It's like the corrective thing. And so here's things I don't think are effective for relationships from afar, and I think there's going to be some do's implied. As I was writing this slide, I couldn't decide where the right apostrophes should have gone on don'ts. So if you have, for all of you English teachers, if you have strong feelings about this and you're very disappointed with the don'ts with that apostrophe, I feel your pain. I was thinking about this earlier. So as I move into these different don'ts, I'm just going to sprinkle them in for the next few minutes. I want to start with acknowledgements. I think this is important for us as a field to think about them. I'm coming to you from Redwood City, California. I'm on the Ramaytush and Ohlone unceded territory of the Ramaytush and Ohlone tribes. This is their land. We are uninvited guests that continue to stay here. I think I encourage teachers and other folks to use the native-land.ca. It's a place you can enter zip codes and addresses and learn a little bit more about whose territory you might be on if you haven't had a chance to do that. I think it's an important recognition for all of us as we better understand the territories that we're a part of right now. I'm also talking to you in a time when we've had 250,000 deaths in this country, almost 250,000 deaths in this country due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 10 million cases, right? We broke a 200,000 confirmed cases in a 24-hour period today. We are in a very dire place as a country, and so I want to acknowledge this as kind of the weight with which we have this conversation. We kind of have this continuing rise and increase to think about the legacies of anti-Blackness that not only persist in this country, but are part of how this country was developed and started, and are written into the kind of literally the constitutional practices that shape and govern what we're doing in this moment. I've been talking about this as a waxing and a waning. It's not that anti-Blackness wasn't always a concern, but it became, I think, more fervent over the summer with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many, many others. I fear it's a moment of waning attention in this moment from a public consciousness, and I want to kind of recognize that as we can't let that happen. White folks had the whole summer to read all the books. You've read the books now. Like it's time for us to do other things. So I just want to recognize that as a consideration. And the last acknowledgement, right? I think we're in a place where 20% of this country doesn't believe our election was fair and that the results are correct, despite there being no evidence to the contrary. And so we are in a moment where our democratic bonds and the promises of a democracy are being tested by all of us, and thinking about what that might mean, and if this country is for us, right? Whatever that might mean. And so I say all this because I think this is fundamental to relationships, right? That this idea of us reading and writing and teaching in systems of colonial violence, designed intentionally so for colonial violence, is a part of what digital classrooms are about. It's part of how we're experiencing COVID-19. And we can't fix these things. An election doesn't fix this. Your students will be able to, learning objectives on the board aren't going to fix this, right? Brandon, unfortunately, BTS also won't fix this. I don't think, but maybe in your breakout room it might. They fixed some things. They did some interesting things with the Trump rally over the summer. I'll give some credit there. But right, I do think empathy and vulnerability and relationships are at the heart of how we start addressing this, and this is where we get to this. And so, the first don't, right? This is the negative pedagogy, is I don't want us to focus just on students when we're talking about relationships and empathy and vulnerability. This is a picture I share my friend Mark often. Back in the analog days when we were schooling in person, I would check in with Mark when I was at in the professor position. He was in his classroom. He would text me and say, "I'm tired, bro. I'm super tired." He was teaching in a school where he lost some students to gun violence, and he was grieving and also working with the family and communities and students to help them heal. And then when he would go home, he then kind of switched his hat. So he was wearing a hat in this picture, and put on his dad hat. And he was a father for 3 young children and a supportive partner in a relationship. And I think about, what's that do to us and our souls as teachers, right? When so much of our identity is about supporting other people, making sure other people are caring, and we don't find the time for healing and processing for ourselves, right? Like that sense of being tired and being exhausted and stressed, the same word, right, that many of you typed in today's chat, right? What's that do for us when we're not focusing on our own relationships? So some questions for us. How are you, let me move myself. How are you caring for yourself and cultivating support for your peers? I think is just a very basic question I want us to be thinking about. I'd rather ask questions than offer answers, right? So how do we sustain our work? How do we sustain the work of our friends and family and colleagues? I ask this as many of you might be caregiving at home at the same time that you're also doing the labor of being a teacher, right? Or you might be in hybrid environments where you're juggling lots and lots of kinds of demands. And I say this to think about, we are by no means equipped for the kinds of massive waves of grief that are roiling through schools right now, right? Like these numbers are, to me, unfathomable, and what we do with them, right, feels like a starting place. And I think the place we start with is ourselves, recognizing the balm, recognizing the how are you, right? Like how can we check in with ourselves and start with our own kind of vulnerability before we even begin thinking about the students, right? I think there is a recognition of us and our humanity that needs to be centered in a lot of this work. I'm going to make an abrupt shift and tell you briefly about a project my colleague Nicole Mira and I have been doing for the last couple of years. It's called the Digital Democratic Dialogue Project. We just call it 3D because it's much shorter. Turns out when we start publishing this, a whole bunch of other academic studies also called 3D, but this is the good one. So the acronyms, they're few and far between, so you have to find the right one. We have, if you want to read the boring, you need some reading to help you fall asleep at night, we have an article that created a tiny URL that you can access. It's tinyurl.com/Mira Garcia. Nicole Mira is my co-author on this. Essentially what we did, and you can kind of see this on the picture here, we linked together 6 different classrooms across the United States, high school English classrooms and 1 middle school classroom. And what we wanted to do was have young people be in dialogue with one another. You can see that there's kind of an even split between Democratic and Republican districts based on the kinds of congressional outcomes from the election. And there's a fairly sizable number of folks who are voting for Trump in 2016 in these districts. We wanted to really kind of get wide socio-political perspectives shaping this conversation. And what we didn't want was to get kids to convince other kids that they were right or wrong, right? What we wanted instead was for kids to just try to understand one another, right? We didn't want to focus on winning an argument. We wanted to focus on kids understanding each other. And so this is where I think about our relationships, particularly for English teachers who so much of our framework and our standards are about things like persuasion, right? Can I convince you that I'm right? Or debate, right? As a kind of argumentative stance. I don't think that's particularly healthy for our country right now, if I'm being perfectly frank, right? And instead, so we looked in Edmodo, we put students in Edmodo from across the country, and we get these excerpts. They're kind of hard to read, so I'll just read the top. So one student starts this thread. These are students who want to talk about guns. So from all 6 classrooms, there's students in this one group. How do y'all, I'm such and such, I go to this school. I'm on my school's competitive shooting team. I look forward to talking about gun issues with y'all. And so this was a student down in Texas who's on his team's competitive shoot, or on his school's competitive shooting team. The next student said competitive shoot. This is a student from Philadelphia. It says competitive shooting team. I've never heard of that. Like this was like a mind-blowing experience, right? Like I can't imagine a world where you have a competitive shooting team, right? Like it just doesn't even make sense. And as they continue to have conversations, right, you can think about the kinds of there's community violence in one setting, there's fear around Second Amendment rights in another setting, right? And we got these kind of beautiful moments of empathy. I tried to block out a lot of this because I didn't want to share students' personal experiences. That's not what I felt like this story was about, but I wanted to see these moments of understanding. So you see one student ask, does anyone have any personal issues around guns or your views that you'd like to share? And then one student says, I've had experiences, so I've had experienced so many violent acts against my family, and give some pretty specific examples of ways that guns and gun violence has shaped this young person's life. And so, there's these beautiful moments, I think, of just purely understanding, right? Trying to listen, trying to understand who individuals are. This led to speculative design. I'm going to skip past a bunch of this just for sake of time, and you can read the boring article version of this, right? But like the key thing I want us to think about is how do we just allow kids to like drive conversation? How do we make that clear? How do you get kids off of being muted, right? Like I think is just a fundamental question I think a lot of us are wondering about. Of course, all of this happened on a website, and so I want to think about a quote from 24 years ago. This is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, a whole bunch of tech dudes, literally, at the time. We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before. And so this is like a long document of the kind of beauty of what the internet's going to be. It's going to be this free land for all people. And it's a statement that was written by cisgendered white men declaring what the internet's supposed to be for all people. And it looks nothing like what we think it is today in terms of this utopian vision. Instead, the internet today is largely about platforms, right? The internet today is, I spend time on Facebook and YouTube and Amazon and Twitter and like 2 other websites, right? Google, right? Like if you think about where your time is on the internet, it's on a very finite number of websites that shape and condition what you can do, right? Each platform has its own kinds of affordances. They allow particular kinds of voices to be amplified. They specify the kinds of literacy practices you can engage in terms of how you write, in terms of how you communicate, and they limit the kinds of freedoms, and there's gatekeepers to decide what kinds of information you're allowed to make. Our classrooms are also platforms, right, that limit the bodies and actions of young people, and so I just want to recognize this as a parallel. But the important thing I want us to recognize is that as we have this conversation on Zoom, we're very limited by the ways that we do this. As I want to present this information to you, I can either share my screen with you and kind of take over your desktop for a little bit. I can kind of do this weird shadow virtual screen thing that I'm doing. I have a chat with you, right? Like we can look at the features and say what is and isn't available based on these tools. These tools aren't going to be what creates powerful relationships. It's going to be what we do with one another. Which I think is my next don't, right? Just don't focus on the tool. The tools don't make sense to me as the things that are going to be what fixes us, right? What we need to focus on are our routines, our spaces, and ourselves. I've been encouraging folks, and then again, this is my boring, like researchy stance, to think about how we understand this world as an ethnographer. What's it mean to interpret this world from this context? So if we, again, take this like very simple fact of the sheer number of confirmed COVID-19 deaths and cases in this country, what's it mean to understand that from an ethnographer, right? Rather than focusing on logistics and opening and operating and kind of functioning in that way, right? If we recognize these numbers as sheer loss of human life and tragedy and sadness, right? We can recognize that all of the language around opening and the economy and all of these other things That's settler colonial logic that is the same kind of logic that allows us to endorse a concept like slavery, right? That allows us to see people as bodies rather than people as people, right? Like these are the same kinds of logics that I think that are driving many of the policy conversations, but we're not allowed to think about it from that perspective. We don't have time for that. Similarly, and when you recognize it in this way, right, this is a recognition that the system is functioning absolutely perfectly in this moment, right? Because of the ways that these things are operating, it continues to racialize bodies on Zoom screens, right? And so we can think about the ways that people are being punished, people are being disciplined, the ways the school to prison pipeline continues to manifest, even through bandwidth and Zoom and all of these other kinds of contexts. So my don'ts, just to kind of make sure we wrap up here. Don't just focus on students, right? What's it mean to center ourselves and our own perspectives and our bomb and how we're doing? Don't just focus on winning in your classroom. What are the ways that we can make sure that other people, that other perspectives are being shaped and cultivated? Don't assume that the platform is your friend, right? The Twitter, the Facebook, the Edmodo, the Zoom, the Google Classroom, the Flipgrid. I want to name all of the teacher-friendly ones too. None of those are your friend, right? Those are all for someone else. Epic Reads, they're down the street from me. They're fine, but they're not your friend, right? All of these are tools, and they're not made for you and your feelings and your students and your relationships. They're made for profit. We're a part of that product. What do we do as a result of that? Don't focus on the tools, right? Focus on us, focus on understanding, focus on listening, right? Amidst all of these, I think there's a sense of needing to be vulnerable. What's it mean for us to center, starting off with you know what, I'm not okay, right? How would that change the dynamics of your classroom if you recognize and acknowledge I'm not okay? What, do you lose power in that context? Probably, and I think in a good way. I think that's healthy. What's that mean to start with being vulnerable if you're expecting your students to be vulnerable? I think that's the thing that we should ask. So some wrap-up-y questions. Again, I don't really have good answers. I mainly have questions. What kind of place are you co-constructing? What worlds do you help make possible? What beliefs are being affirmed through the kinds of don'ts that you're thinking about in your own classroom setting? How do you continually reinterrogate yourself and yourselves? We are multiple beings. How are you continuing to excavate who you are, the bombs that you're feeling, how are you feeling right now? How is that all happening for you right now? And how do you cultivate an ethos of healing and wholeness, right? Both for yourself, for your students, for this profession that's being tested, for this country that's being tested, for your community, right? What does healing and wholeness mean? How can you start from there as you move forward? Thank you for your time. I appreciate getting to blabber at you for a few minutes.